Hello, and welcome, friends. Tonight, we return once more to the quiet world of Willow Lane, where Hazel, Bramble, Pipwick, and the twins remind us that even the simplest days can carry warmth and meaning. So, settle in with a blanket, maybe a cup of tea or cocoa, and let's step together into the gentle rhythm of Willow Lane. The Willow Lane Almanac. It was one of those late summer mornings that seemed to spill gold over everything, the kind of light that made even the cobwebs glisten like silver threads strung with pearls. The meadow was still damp with dew, and the soft hum of bees was only just beginning to rise, as though the whole world were clearing its throat to sing. Bramble the badger, sturdy and deliberate in his movements, ambled down Willow Lane with a walking stick tucked beneath one arm. He enjoyed mornings most of all, the crispness of the air, the scent of warm earth mixed with clover, the way shadows stretched long and thin across the lane before the sun climbed too high. He came upon Pipwick the mouse, perched rather precariously atop a stone near the hedge, scribbling furiously into a battered little notebook. Pipwick's ears twitched as Bramble's footsteps drew near. "What's it you've got there?" Bramble asked, leaning over slightly. "My notes," Pipwick declared. "Observations of the world. Look here. Yesterday's entry. Cloud shaped like a teapot drifting over the bend, slight drizzle by midday, 2 snails seen racing across the path." He flipped the pages eagerly. "I've dozens of them." Bramble chuckled, his whiskers twitching. "And what do you do with all those notes? Keep them to yourself?" "Why, yes. Though sometimes I read them back on quiet evenings. Helps me remember." But Pipwick's nose quivered thoughtfully. "Wouldn't it be splendid to make a proper book of it? An almanac of Willow Lane." "An almanac?" Bramble repeated. The word rolled about pleasantly on his tongue. "Yes, a record of our days, weather, flowers, harvests, recipes, anything useful or charming. Not just for ourselves, but for our neighbors too." Pipwick's eyes shone with excitement. Imagine Hazel the hedgehog reading aloud the dates of the first blackberries, or the twins turning the pages to see sketches of mushrooms, or Mrs. Lark noting when the swallows return. Bramble stood silent a moment, listening to the bees drone among the brambles. The idea warmed him. "You may be onto something, but it would be a great deal of work." "All the better," cried Pipwick, hopping down from his stone. Work shared as joy doubled. "Why, we could all contribute. Hazel with her recipes, you with your fine sense of weather, and I with my sketches. Why, by next year it could be thick as a proper volume." At that moment, Hazel herself appeared, a basket of early apples balanced on her hip, and her spines catching the sunlight like a halo. "What's this talk of volumes and weather?" she asked. And so Pipwick explained, his paws flying with gestures, his enthusiasm bubbling over like a kettle on the boil. Hazel listened, then smiled in her steady way. "It sounded a fine plan. Something to tie us all together, season by season. I could spare a few pages for apple chutney and rosehip cordial." Bramble's eyes softened. Then it settled. The Willow Lane Almanac. "We'll begin at once." Pipwick nearly danced with delight. "At once indeed. We must gather supplies. Parchment, ink, perhaps a good binding if one can be had." Hazel shook her head with a laugh. "Don't gallop off too quickly. Let's take it one step at a time. After all, an almanac is not built in a day. It grows as the seasons do." So it was that, beneath the buzzing hedge and the glimmer of morning light, the idea was planted. An almanac, humble in beginnings, but destined to hold the very heart of their days. The very next day, the skies darkened as though to test their resolve. By noon, the rain came in earnest, soft at first, then drumming steadily, washing the dust from the hedges and leaving the lane shining dark and slick. Bramble's cottage, snug with its thatched roof and mossy stone walls, became the gathering place. Hazel arrived with her basket, now full of oat biscuits. Pipwick clutched his notebook, and even Mrs. Lark from the oak hollow came fluttering in, shaking the water from her feathers. The fire crackled cheerily, and they all drew close around Bramwell's sturdy oak table. Pipwick spread out his notebook and a clean sheaf of parchment. "We must decide. What shall the almanac contain?" Hazel nibbled a biscuit thoughtfully. "Recipes, certainly. Not only mine. Mrs. Lark has some clever ways with nettles and dandelions." "Birds," Mrs. Lark chirped. "The first robin, the last swallow, the owl that hoots at dusk. I can keep close watch on that." "Weather," Bramwell rumbled, folding his paws. "Signs of frost, storms brewing, the turn of the wind. Those things matter for planting and harvest." "And flowers," Pipwick said earnestly. "The very first violet, the meadow blooms, the hawthorn's froth. Why, the almanac should bloom on the page." They debated warmly, the rain pattering like a drum above them. The twins burst in later, squealing with damp excitement, and insisted on contributing too. Drawings of bugs, funny poems about mud puddles. By the time the light had dimmed to a soft gray, their heads were full of plans. Pipwick had made a long list, his tail twitching with pride. Hazel had promised to try her paw at neat handwriting. Bramwell had set aside his barometer for daily readings, and Mrs. Lark had vowed to note the comings and goings of every feathered creature. At last, as the fire crackled low and mugs of chamomile, tea steamed before them, Bramwell leaned back in his chair and smiled. "It seems we are committed. The almanac shall begin with today's weather, and let it be said, heavy rain, biscuits shared, and good company gathered close." Pipwick scribbled the words down with a flourish. "And so the first page is born." The others clapped their paws, or wings in Mrs. Lark's case, and the rain outside seemed suddenly less dreary, for it had given them their beginning. The following week dawned with a teasing brightness. After the rains, the meadows seemed to swell with greenness. Bramwell rose early, intent on making the almanac's first proper observation. He had noticed a clump of meadow, saffron by the bend, their buds fat and promising. "This will do nicely," he said aloud, fetching his notebook. The precise hour of bloom, recorded for posterity. Armed with his pocket watch and a folding stool, he made his way to the meadow. The buds stood proudly among the grass, dewdrops still clinging to their tips. Bramwell settled down, set his watch upon his knee, and waited, and waited. The buds quivered slightly in the breeze, but did not open. Pipwick, passing by, stopped in surprise. "What are you doing out here, Bramwell? You look like a statue." "Timing the bloom," Bramwell replied, never taking his eyes off the stubborn flower. Pipwick grinned. "Ah, science at work. I'll fetch Hazel. She must see this." Soon Hazel arrived, carrying a loaf wrapped in cloth. "You'll be here all day if you wait on flowers to suit your schedule. Why not note when they do open, instead of trying to catch them in the act?" But Bramwell was resolute. An almanac requires precision. The hours wore on. Pipwick sketched the flowers. Hazel sliced bread for sandwiches, and the twins came charging through, scattering grasshoppers. Mrs. Lark perched overhead, offering commentary on the clouds. Still, the saffron refused to oblige. At last, near dusk, Bramwell rubbed his eyes wearily. "Perhaps tomorrow," he muttered, jotting down a careful note. "Meadow saffron, budded but unbloomed. Observation postponed." Hazel patted his paw kindly. "Sometimes, Bramwell, nature keeps her own clock." Yet even his failure became part of the almanac, and when Pipwick wrote it up later that night, he added a cheerful sketch of Bramwell squinting at the stubborn buds. The page was titled, "The Flower That Wouldn't Bloom." And so the almanac grew, not perfect but true, filled with the gentle humor of their days. The following week brought skies as changeable as a squirrel's moods. At dawn, a haze of mist hung over the meadow, only to burn away in a dazzling blue by mid-morning. Then, without warning, clouds rolled in, tumbling like wool sacks across the heavens. Pipwick, ever ready with his notebook, had begun sketching shapes. An elephant here, a kettle there, a grand sailing ship complete with billowed sails. When Bramwell arrived, barometer tucked under his arm, he found a little mouse lying on his back in the grass, pointing at the sky with delighted squeaks. "Bramwell," Pipwick called. "Look there, a dragon, and just beyond it a pudding bowl." Bramwell lowered himself onto a tree stump and set the barometer carefully on his lap. "Clouds are not puddings, Pipwick. They are signs. These are cumulus, fat with moisture. We'll see rain before long." Hazel, who had been gathering herbs nearby, strolled over with her basket swinging. "Cumulus cirrus, pudding bowls, it matters little. What counts is whether I can dry my time on the line without it being soaked again." Mrs. Lark, swooping down to perch on a low branch, ruffled her feathers. "I say the sky tells many stories. One moment it whispers rain, the next it promises fair sailing winds. Who's to say who's right?" That was all the encouragement Pipwick needed. "Then let's make it an experiment for the almanac. We each record what we believe these clouds foretell, and tomorrow we shall see who is correct." The suggestion sparked instant enthusiasm. Pipwick scribbled their predictions into his notebook. Bramwell, rain within the day. Hazel, brief shower, but clear skies for drying herbs by afternoon. Mrs. Lark, shifting winds, uncertain weather, but likely dry. Pipwick, a spectacular sunset, crimson and gold, no rain at all. They sealed their wagers with a handful of hazelnuts. Hazel supplied them from her pocket, which Pipwick tucked into an envelope labeled the cloud debate. The day wore on with everyone peering at the sky whenever chores allowed. Hazel hung her time cautiously. The twins raced about insisting they could smell rain on the wind, and Bramwell stood on his doorstep at intervals to check the barometer with a grave frown. By late afternoon, the clouds thickened, their bellies darkening. A soft drizzle began, just as Bramwell had predicted. But then, quite as Hazel had promised, it passed within the hour, leaving the world fresh and sparkling. The sky cleared in time for her time to dry nicely on the line. Mrs. Lark crowed that her prediction of uncertain weather was also correct, while Pipwick pointed triumphantly at the horizon as the sun sank, painting the sky in blazing streaks of crimson and gold. "Well," Bramwell admitted, as they gathered by the hedge that evening, "it seems we were all correct in our own way." Pipwick wrote the entry with gusto, decorating the margins with tiny sketches of dragons, puddings, and time bundles fluttering in the breeze. The page was titled "The Debate of the Clouds," and beneath it he added in neat letters, "Lesson: Nature rarely belongs to just one opinion." Though Hazel was practical, she could not help being secretly delighted at the idea that her recipes might live forever in the pages of the almanac. One bright morning, she arrived at Bramwell's door with flour, dusting her apron and a determined glint in her eyes. "Today," she declared, setting a basket on the table with a thump, "we begin the cookery section." Inside the basket lay neat bundles of wild mint, a pot of honey, and a parcel of oat flour. Pipwick leaned forward eagerly, whiskers twitching. "What marvelous creation will it be?" "Mint and honey oat cakes," Hazel said firmly. "Simple, nourishing, and fit for any traveler's pocket." The kitchen became a bustle of activity. Bramwell measured water with solemn care. Pipwick ground oats to make them finer, and the twins summoned to assist. Fetched firewood and nearly toppled the kindling basket twice. Mrs. Lark perched on the sill, offering unasked advice about the size of the patties. Hazel managed the oven with an air of calm authority, shaping the little rounds with paws dusted in flour. Soon the cottage filled with a warm, sweet aroma that made every nose twitch and every stomach rumble. When at last the oat cakes emerged golden and crisp, they arranged them on a plate and let them cool just enough before sampling. The taste was a perfect balance, hearty oats softened by honey sweetness, lifted by a faint coolness of mint. "Delicious," Pipwick declared, crumbs already in his whiskers. "This must be the first recipe written in the almanac." Bramble nodded. "It will last the ages." Hazel wrote it out carefully in her neatest hand. "Mint and honey oat cakes. To 1 cup of oat flour, add 2 pawfuls of chopped mint, 1 spoon of honey, a dash of water, and a sprinkle of salt. Shape into small rounds and bake until golden. Best enjoyed warm, but travel well in pockets." Pipwick insisted on drawing a tiny sketch of an oat cake with steam rising, while the twins scribbled a rhyme in the margin. "Golden rounds both crisp and sweet. Mint and honey make the treat." That evening, as they munched the last of the oat cakes by candlelight, the friends agreed that the almanac had gained not just a recipe, but a memory. The sound of laughter in Bramwell's kitchen, the warmth of the oven, and the rain-washed freshness of the day outside. One evening not long after, Pipwick had an idea that lit him up brighter than the fireflies flickering over the meadow. "The almanac deserves a lantern," he proclaimed, bursting into Bramwell's study where the pages now lay bound with ribbon. "Something to hang over the table whenever we add a new entry, so we know it is a moment worth remembering." Hazel raised a brow. "A lantern just for writing?" "Precisely. A ritual, a glow, a sense of occasion," Pipwick said, already sketching designs. "A round lantern of paper, painted with stars and vines, to hang from a beam. Whenever we gather to add a page, we'll light it." "The almanac lantern," Bramwell considered. "A fine notion, but paper lanterns are delicate. One stray spark, and your almanac will be ash." "Then we'll make it of tin," Hazel suggested, "punched with holes for stars, so the light shines through safely." The project was set. Over the next days, Bramwell lent his sturdy paws for hammering. Pipwick provided sketches, and Hazel cut stars and swirls into the tin with careful taps of her awl. The twins clamored to help, though most of their efforts resulted in lopsided hearts and peculiar shapes that looked more like beetles than stars. Still, Hazel kept their pieces, promising they would shine all the same. At last the lantern was finished, hung from a stout hook above Bramwell's writing table. When the candle was lit, tiny points of light scattered across the walls and ceiling like a galaxy, making the whole room feel enchanted. They inaugurated it with an entry about the lantern itself. Made of tin, hammered by steady paws, lit first on a mild evening with biscuits on the table and friends gathered near. Pipwick added a sketch of the glowing stars, while Hazel wrote in her tidy script, "To be lit whenever new pages are added." As they sat in the golden glow, Bramwell felt a swell of quiet pride. Their almanac was no longer just a notion, nor even a book in progress. It was becoming a tradition, something stitched into the fabric of their days. Outside, the crickets chirped and the river whispered softly. Inside, under the lantern's glow, the almanac grew, page by careful page, a living record of the little world they so dearly loved. The end of summer drew close, and with it came talk of the harvest fair at Oak Hollow, a gathering that all the creatures of field and would look forward to every year. It was not merely a market or a dance. It was the season's great celebration, with stalls of goods, contests of skill, and, most importantly, the chance to see friends from far corners of the valley. Bramwell had not attended in years, finding the bustle too much for his quiet tastes. Yet Pipwick was determined. "The almanac must have a page on the harvest fair," he cried, clapping his tiny paws together. What kind of record of the year ignores the grandest event of the season? Hazel, carrying a jar of rosehip syrup to Bramwell's table, nodded firmly. "He's right. And besides, Bramwell, you could use a day out. You spend far too much time polishing that barometer." The twins, overhearing, squealed in excitement. "Will there be races? And pies? And honeycombs?" They chattered so fast that Hazel had to gently usher them outside before they tripped over Bramwell's furniture. The preparations began in earnest. Pipwick decided he would bring a display of their growing almanac, though Hazel warned him sternly to keep it safe and undercloth to avoid sticky paw prints. Hazel herself resolved to bake spiced apple loaves, fragrant with nutmeg and cinnamon, to sell at the fair. Bramwell reluctantly admitted he could bring jars of his best preserved blackberries. The next week was a blur of activity. Hazel's cottage smelled constantly of baking. Even Mrs. Lark admitted she could hardly keep her wings from fluttering too close to the window in hopes of crumb. Pipwick spent hours creating a miniature display stand from twigs and ribbon, complete with a little sign that read the Willow Lane Almanac, a record of our year. Bramwell muttered that he would rather stay home, but he still polished the lids of his jars until they gleamed and even searched his cupboards for a cloth bright enough to catch the eye. "If I must attend," he told Hazel gruffly, "then at least our table will look respectable." The evening before the fair, they gathered at Bramwell's with baskets stacked and ready. The lantern shone overhead, scattering starry light across the walls as Pipwick made a solemn speech. "Tomorrow, we will carry the work of our paws into the world. Let it be known that the almanac is not only for us, but for all who wish to read the story of our days." Hazel smiled, brushing flour from her apron. "Tomorrow we celebrate, and the almanac shall have its most festive entry yet." The morning dawned clear, with a sharpness in the air that promised autumn's approach. Carts rolled along the lane, pulled by donkeys or pushed by eager paws, all bound for Oak Hollow. The little group from Willow Lane set out together, baskets balanced. Pipwick perched proudly on top of Hazel's apple loaves. As they neared the clearing where the fair was held, the sounds of laughter and music carried on the breeze. Stalls were already bustling, garlands of hops and late-blooming flowers strung between branches overhead. Bees hummed lazily among the booths of honeycombs, while squirrels showed off jars of nut butter and foxes sold polished stones. They found a place for their own table near the edge of the meadow. Hazel arranged her apple loaves with practiced neatness. Bramwell set his jars in precise rows, and Pipwick unveiled the almanac with a flourish, spreading a cloth of blue over the table before placing the book at its center. The fair was a whirl of activity. Friends old and new stopped by, eager to taste Hazel's fragrant loaves, so popular that they were gone within an hour. Bramwell's blackberry preserves drew praise from an elderly otter who declared them the finest this side of the river bend. But it was the almanac that caused the greatest stir. Curious creatures leaned over the table, peering at Pipwick's tiny illustrations and Hazel's neat script. "What is this?" they asked. "A book of clouds? Recipes? Notes on the year?" Pipwick explained with all the enthusiasm of a scholar unveiling a great treasure. "It is a record of the seasons of our lives here on Willow Lane. A guide, a memory, a celebration. Each page tells a little story of storms, of herbs, of cakes, even of lanterns." To his delight, visitors lingered, reading aloud passages and laughing over the sketches. A mole requested to copy the oatcake recipe, while Hedgehog promised to write down a rhyme for the almanac's next section. Children clustered around, asking if their names might be written into the pages. By afternoon, Hazel and Bramwell sat content, their baskets empty, their hearts lightened by the warmth of the fair. Even Bramwell, usually so reserved, found himself smiling as he watched Pipwick beam at the crowd around their table. When the sun dipped low and lanterns were lit, they packed up their things, weary but happy. On the way home, Pipwick hummed merrily. "The almanac has traveled beyond us now. It belongs to the whole valley." Hazel agreed softly. "And tomorrow, we will add today's joy to its pages." The next day, with baskets empty but hearts still brimming, they gathered once again at Bramwell's table. The tin lantern flickered, scattering stars on the walls as Pipwick sharpened his quill with care. "This entry," he announced, "shall be the grandest yet." He began with a sketch of the fair. Garlands strung from trees, stalls bustling with creatures, a fiddle player dancing at the edge of the meadow. Hazel, with her usual calm precision, added a description of her apple loaves and the scent of cinnamon drifting on the breeze. Bramble wrote of the preserves, noting the otter's praise and the satisfaction of seeing his jars gleam in the sun. But it was the response to the almanac that received the most care. Pipwick recorded every question asked, every rhyme recited by visiting children, every paw that touched the pages with wonder. He wrote, "On this day, the almanac left Willow Lane and entered the hearts of the valley. It was read, admired, and welcomed. Its purpose was understood, not merely a record, but a bridge between us all." Hazel leaned over and added in her neatest script, "A book grows heavier with each word, but lighter with each heart it touches." When at last the entry was complete, they lit the lantern and sat quietly for a moment, letting the glow wash over them. Bramwell, his voice gruff but softer than usual, murmured, "Perhaps this almanac will outlast us. Perhaps one day, others will add their own pages." Pipwick's eyes shone. That is precisely the dream. Outside, the fields shimmered with the first hint of frost. The harvest fair had marked the turning of the season, and now autumn would come in earnest. But inside, under the glow of their lantern, the friends felt a warmth that would carry them far into the colder days ahead. The morning of the first frost arrived quietly, with no fanfare except the silvery sheen it cast over the fields. Pipwick was the first to notice it, as he scampered outside to fetch kindling for Bramwell's fire. His tiny paws crunched on blades of grass that sparkled like glass, and his breath rose in small clouds before his whiskers. "Hazel!" he squeaked, darting toward her cottage. "Bramwell, come look. The whole meadow has been painted overnight." Hazel, wrapping her shawl tighter about her shoulders, stepped to her window and smiled. The garden, once green and earthy, now glittered beneath a delicate frost, each leaf traced with a white edge. She opened the window and let the crisp air rush in. "Beautiful," she whispered, though the chill made her nose pink. Bramwell, less eager to rush into the cold, shuffled to his doorway with his heavy wool scarf around his neck. He peered out, his spectacles fogging almost at once. "Yes, yes," he grumbled, though his eyes softened as he took in the sight of the frosted hedgerows and the glittering riverbank. "Mark it down, Pipwick. The first frost of the season, clear sky, calm air, mild wind." And so Pipwick did. Back inside Bramwell's parlor, with the stove already crackling, he added a neat entry. "On this morning, frost dressed every leaf and blade in silver. The sun rose over it gently, turning the meadow into a mirror of stars." Hazel suggested they take a walk to see the frost more closely before the sun melted it away. They wrapped themselves in scarves and mittens, Hazel carrying a basket, just in case there were rosehips to be found, and set off down Willow Lane. Everywhere they looked, the ordinary had become extraordinary. Spiderwebs, usually unnoticed in corners, now glistened like fine lace. Twigs glittered. The river carried shards of ice along its edge, chiming softly as they bumped together. The twins bounded ahead, leaving tiny paw prints in the white grass, and Hazel laughed as they slipped and slid, their giggles echoing across the still morning. Even Bramwell admitted, after some prodding, that there was something noteworthy about such a transformation. When they returned, cheeks flushed and paws tingling, Hazel brewed a pot of rosehip tea sweetened with honey. Bramwell sat close to the fire, thawing his paws, while Pipwick sketched a frosted oak leaf in the margin of the almanac. That night, as the lantern glowed in Bramwell's window, Pipwick added another line beneath his sketch. "Winter whispers before it speaks." The frost is its first word. The days that followed the frost grew steadily cooler, and Hazel decided it was time for her annual autumn gathering. Each year, before the real cold set in, she invited her neighbors for an evening of food, stories, and a sharing of what each had saved for winter. Preparations began a full day ahead. Hazel scrubbed her little kitchen until it shone, then set about baking savory pies filled with carrots and turnips, and a sweet pear tart that made Pipwick's whiskers twitch with anticipation. She strung garlands of dried orange slices and cranberries, their colors glowing against the wooden beams. The twins gathered kindling for the fire, bringing armfuls of sticks to Bramwell's hearth so the parlor would be warm enough for company. Bramwell, though claiming he disliked a noisy house, secretly polished his old teapot and unearthed a tin of peppermint leaves he had been saving for a special occasion. By evening, Hazel's cottage was alight with lanterns. The smell of baking and simmering broth wafted into the lane, drawing neighbors near. Mrs. Lark arrived first, carrying a basket of seed cakes. Behind her came old Mr. Badger with jars of pickled roots, then a family of hedgehogs balancing a dish of roasted chestnuts. The little parlor filled quickly with warmth and chatter. Bramwell poured tea while Hazel brought out her pies, setting them on the table beside jars of honey and bowls of fruit. The air buzzed with friendly talk, how the frost had touched the gardens, how the river was running lower this year, and what each had gathered to keep them through winter. After the meal, Pipwick brought forth the almanac. "Tonight's entry must capture the heart of this gathering," he announced. Neighbors leaned close as he described their feast, sketching a quick likeness of Hazel's pear tart, then inviting each guest to add something of their own. Mrs. Lark contributed a short verse about lantern light on frosty nights. Mr. Badger wrote in his slow, steady script, "A storehouse full is no use without a table shared." The hedgehogs added a tiny drawing of a chestnut, smiling broadly as Pipwick praised their artistry. By the time the gathering drew to a close, the almanac had another page glowing with life and voices. Hazel stood at her doorway, shawl wrapped tight, watching her neighbors disappear into the crisp night. She smiled at Pipwick, Bramwell, and the twins lingering by her hearth. "This," she said softly, "is why we keep the almanac. So even when the snow is deep and the nights are long, we can open it and remember evenings like this." Bramwell gave a small grunt of agreement, though his eyes shone in the lantern light. As October deepened, Willow Lane began to quiet. The birds that had filled the hedges all summer had flown south, and the fields grew bare as harvests were stored away. Even the twins, usually full of bounding energy, slowed their play, spending more time curled by Bramwell's stove with books and cups of warm milk. One particularly still morning, Hazel remarked that the lane itself seemed to breathe slower. "It's as if the whole valley is preparing for sleep," she said, stirring her porridge. Bramwell nodded, making a note in his weather log. "Shorter days, cooler nights. The land knows what's coming. We should too." And so their rhythm shifted. They no longer lingered outside after supper, but retreated indoors sooner, lighting the lantern earlier each evening. Hazel mended woolens by the fire. Pipwick worked carefully on sketches for the almanac, and Bramwell polished his weather instruments. One afternoon, Pipwick insisted they walk to the far end of the lane, for fresh air before we turn into creatures of the hearth entirely. They did, finding the hedgerows now sparse, berries long picked, branches bare but beautiful in their simplicity. The air smelled of smoke from distant chimneys, and a faint mist curled along the river. As they walked, Pipwick grew unusually quiet. At last he said, "I like the fair and the gatherings, but I think I like these quiet days most of all, when nothing extraordinary happens, but we're all still together." Hazel smiled. "Everyday things can be extraordinary, Pipwick. That's what the almanac is teaching us." When they returned, Bramwell made a simple stew of potatoes and leeks, and Hazel baked a round of brown bread. They ate by the fire in companionable silence, listening to the wind against the shutters. Later, Pipwick added a line to the almanac. As the lane grows quiet, so do we. But in the hush there is comfort, and in the stillness there is peace. The lantern glowed softly, the only star in their little world, and outside, autumn pressed gently toward winter. The evenings grew darker still, until it seemed to Hazel that dusk came before she had even washed the supper dishes. To cheer the lane against the early night, she decided to hang a lantern by her garden gate. It was an old copper thing, dented on one side, but its glass panes caught the light of a single candle and spread it warmly across the path. Pipwick was enchanted at once. "It looks like a star that's fallen into your hedge," he said, tilting his head as the glow caught in his eyes. Hazel laughed. "Then let it guide weary travelers. Though I think the only travelers we see here are you three." Still, the lantern did make a difference. Coming home from Bramwell's cottage one evening, Hazel herself felt comforted when its glow met her at the bend in the path, shining against the dark hedge. And soon enough, Pipwick decided that Bramwell's gate, too, needed such a star. The two of them set about cleaning Bramwell's own lantern, which had been left forgotten in a shed, crusted with cobwebs. With Hazel's rag and Pipwick's boundless energy, it shone again. That evening, they lit it, and the parlor window no longer stood alone against the dusk. The gate itself seemed to beckon warmly. The twins grew excited by this fashion of lanterns and begged to hang one of their own. Bramwell, muttering about extravagance, nevertheless helped them trim a smaller lantern and fit it with a safe little candle. Thus, Willow Lane took on a new face at night. 3 golden lights, like beads strung along the hedgerow, welcoming anyone who passed. And though few did, the sight brought a quiet happiness to those who lived there. One evening, as the friends gathered in Bramwell's parlor, Pipwick carefully inscribed a new entry in the almanac. "Lanterns hung by the gates give warmth not to the traveler's paws, but to the heart. They make the dark less empty and the lane less lonely." Bramwell sniffed, as though it were all sentimental fuss, but his spectacles hid a smile. The days passed, and with them came sharper winds. Hazel wore her shawl tight even inside, and Bramwell complained that his ink froze in the nib if left too long. One morning, Pipwick went out to fetch water and returned with a curious treasure, a single gray feather, small and soft, caught on the thorn of the hedge. "It must belong to the sparrows," he said, laying it reverently on the almanac's open page. "Though where they've all gone, I cannot say." Bramwell adjusted his spectacles and peered at it. "A common thing, a feather," he said, "blown down from some bird overhead." But Hazel saw the shine in Pipwick's eyes. "Common or not, it's part of the season," she said gently. "Why not keep it as a token?" And so Pipwick sketched the feather, his lines careful and delicate, shading it until it seemed ready to lift from the page. Beside it, Hazel wrote, "The sparrows leave, but they do not forget us. They send word on the wind, in a single feather left behind." The feather itself they tucked into the almanac, pressed flat between the pages. "It will remind us," Pipwick said, "that even the smallest things are worth noticing." That afternoon, Bramwell, perhaps feeling guilty for his dismissive words, rummaged in a drawer until he found an old magnifying lens. He offered it to Pipwick. "For your sketches," he said gruffly. "Details matter." Pipwick beamed. He spent the rest of the day peering at the feather's barbs in vain, sketching them in close-up until the page looked as if a whole flock had settled there. That night, as the lanterns glowed outside and the wind rattled the shutters, Hazel poured them each a cup of hot milk, and they sat quietly watching Pipwick work. The lane was hushed, the world seemed to shrink to the warm circle of the hearth, and the little feather bound them to the wide, unseen skies beyond. November crept in with a voice of its own, the wind. It hissed through the tall grass by the riverbank, shook the hedge at Hazel's garden, and moaned softly down the lane at night. At first, the sound unsettled Pipwick, who asked Bramwell more than once if the shutters were secure. But Bramwell, always eager to observe, declared that the almanac must have a record of the wind's behavior. There is art in noticing, he said, but there is also discipline. Weather is a pattern, and patterns tell us truths. So each evening, the friends sat by the hearth while Bramwell asked them to describe what they had heard. Hazel said it sometimes hummed like a kettle about to boil. Pipwick thought it whooshed like a cloak swept quickly round a corner. The twins insisted it howled like wolves, though they had never met a wolf in their lives. Bramwell jotted down each description in his tidy hand, labeling the notes by day: a whistle, a hum, a moan, a howl. Pipwick added little sketches beside the words: leaves dancing, a shutter shaking, smoke bending sideways from a chimney. One especially blustery night, when the lane itself seemed to quiver, Hazel made everyone stay close to the fire. If we listen too long, she said, the wind might carry our thoughts away. Pipwick, curled in his blanket, whispered, "Do you think the wind has words of its own?" Bramwell paused, pen in hand. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "but if it does, it speaks in a tongue too old for us to understand. We can only answer by keeping warm and by remembering its voice." That night, Pipwick added his own line to the almanac beneath Bramwell's notes. The wind is the forest speaking. If we cannot answer, we can at least listen. The lanterns flickered outside, the shutters creaked, and within, their circle of light held firm against the restless voice of the season. The frost that had once seemed so delicate grew heavier with each dawn, and soon the grass no longer sparkled, but lay stiff and white, crunching underpaw. Hazel knew what this meant. Wood must be gathered in earnest before the first true snow came. One morning, she announced her plan at Bramwell's parlor, where the friends huddled close to the stove. "It's no good waiting," she said firmly, spooning honey into Pipwick's porridge. "If we are to keep the lanes bright and the hearths burning, every neighbor will need their store full. I'll not have anyone caught short once the snow is upon us." Bramwell sighed, but agreed. Practical advice. The almanac should record this day as the first official gathering of firewood. The meadow is littered with fallen branches since the storm. Best we make use. And so they set out, wrapped in scarves and mittens, baskets slung over shoulders. The lane looked different in the pale, hard light. The hedges brittle, the trees bare, the ground patched with frost that lingered even at noon. The work itself became almost a game. The twins scurried to and fro, dragging sticks twice their length, tumbling into heaps of leaves that crumbled into dust. Pipwick darted about, announcing each discovery as though it were treasure. A perfect length for the stove, a knot that looks like a fox's tail. Hazel patiently bundled the branches together with twine. Bramwell, more methodical, inspected each piece. "Damp, too thick. This one's suitable. That one may be left to dry another season." He muttered steadily as he stacked, until Hazel laughed. "One might think you were marking specimens in a museum, not firewood for the hearth." By midday, their baskets were full. They paused by the riverbank to rest and share a simple meal of bread and cheese. The river was edged with thin ice, and Pipwick amused himself by tossing pebbles, watching them skid across the surface before cracking through with a musical plink. When at last they carried their loads home, the lane looked almost festive with the tidy stacks of wood now rising by each cottage door. Hazel set hers neatly beside her shed. The twins proudly piled theirs in little towers, and Bramwell, of course, arranged his with mathematical precision, measuring each log against the next. That evening, Pipwick added to the almanac, "Firewood gathered today will become tomorrow's comfort. Every branch tells us. Warmth begins in the forest before it glows on the hearth." Hazel, sipping her tea, nodded. "True enough. and warmth shared is worth twice as much. It came quietly, just as Hazel had predicted, on a still night, when even the wind seemed to pause. Bramwell, roused from his sleep by some instinct, looked out to see flakes drifting past his window, white against the black. By morning, the whole world had changed. Pipwick burst from his cottage before breakfast, squealing with delight. His paws sank deep into the snow, sending up little sprays as he bounded across the lane. "It's here," he shouted. "Snow. Real snow." Hazel, more sedate, stepped on her porch wrapped in her shawl. She smiled at the sight, the hedgerows buried under white humps, the roofs capped like iced cakes, the trees holding heavy crowns. Even the river was hushed, its edges blurred where snow lay thick. Bramwell emerged with his notebook already in paw. "First snowfall of the season," he announced. "Depth, 4 inches by my measure. Time, during the night of the 23rd. Conditions, calm, steady." He stooped to collect a sample in a jar, as though the flakes were rare specimens. The twins were wild with glee. They rolled in the drifts, tumbled headlong, then scrambled up to pelt each other with snowballs. Hazel called after them to mind their scarves, but her voice was more fond than stern. The friends spent the morning simply walking through the transformed world. Every step crunched, every branch gleamed. Their usual landmarks, the stile, the hollow log, the bend in the lane, were disguised, softened by white. Pipwick insisted it was like living inside a storybook. By noon, they returned to Bramwell's parlor, stamping snow from their boots, laughing as they shook it from their fur. Hazel brewed hot chocolate thick with cream, and Bramwell finally put aside his notes long enough to warm his paws at the stove. That afternoon, Pipwick made perhaps his most elaborate sketch yet. The lane blanketed in snow, lanterns glowing faintly, smoke curling from chimneys. He spent an hour shading the roofs, carefully cross-hatching each tree, until the page looked alive with winter stillness. Beneath it, Hazel wrote, "Snow quiets the world so we may hear our own hearts more clearly. The lane, hushed and white, listens with us." The almanac closed softly on the page, as if guarding the secret of the snow within. With snow came shorter days and longer nights. By 4 o'clock, the sky already darkened, and by supper, the lane was silent but for the crunch of an occasional passerby. The friends found themselves drawing together almost every evening now, in Bramwell's parlor or Hazel's kitchen, content simply to share the hush. One evening, the wind rattled outside, flinging snow against the shutters. Bramwell tended the stove with steady care, while Hazel knitted a scarf for one of the twins. Pipwick sprawled on the rug with a sketchbook, tongue sticking out in concentration as he tried to capture the glint of firelight on the kettle. Conversation drifted softly. Hazel spoke of her grandmother's stories of winters past, of rivers frozen so hard that carts could cross them. Bramwell muttered about the unlikelihood of such extremes returning, citing patterns in his weather logs. Pipwick interrupted with a question about whether lantern light could melt snowflakes, an idea Hazel called charming, and Bramwell dismissed as nonsense. At one point, the twins, already in their nightshirts, patted in sleepily to curl by the fire. Hazel tucked them beneath a blanket, and their gentle breathing soon joined the crackle of the stove. It was not an evening of excitement or event, but one of warmth, of presence. Pipwick later wrote in the almanac, "Not every day needs adventure. Sometimes the adventure is in simply keeping close, listening to the fire, and watching the snow fall beyond the shutters." Hazel added her own line below, "Comfort is not made of great things, but of small ones repeated each day." The lanterns glowed faint outside the windows, marking the lane against the storm, and within, the little circle of light held them all, quiet, content, together. The end. Thank you so much for joining me in this chapter of Willow Lane. I hope the quiet moments, the snow-dusted paths, and the warmth of the hearth brought a little peace to your day. If you enjoyed this cozy tale, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who could use a bit of calm and comfort. Until next time, may your evenings be warm, your days be gentle, and your heart always find the quiet joys in life.